Chapter 4 Skeleton Island at Last. As Bob awoke, he was puzzled to see a slanting ceiling with striped wallpaper over his head. Then he remembered. He wasn't at home. He was 3,000 miles from Rocky Beach, in a town called Fishingport, on Atlantic Bay. He sat up and looked round. He was in the upper half of a double bunk. Below him, Pete was fast asleep. In a bed a few feet away, Jupiter Jones was also sleeping. Bob lay back again, thinking over the strange events of the previous night. There was a rap on the door. "Boys," it was Mrs. Barton, the plump, cheerful landlady. "Breakfast is waiting. And Mr. Crenshaw's downstairs. Be down in 5 minutes or we'll throw it out." "We'll be there." Bob leaped down to the floor. Pete and Jupiter, awakened by the voices, were soon dressed, and they all hurried downstairs. In a bright yellow dining room, decorated with various nautical objects, breakfast was waiting. 2 men sat at the table conversing in low tones and drinking coffee. Pete's father, a large, ruggedly built man, jumped up as the boys entered. "Pete!" he exclaimed, putting an arm round his son. He shook hands with Bob and Jupiter. "I certainly was glad last night to hear you'd been found and were safe. By then you were asleep, so I hurried back to Skeleton Island. We have to guard our supplies and equipment every minute these days. But we'll come to that later. Right now I want your story." As the 3 investigators ate, they took turns in telling what had happened the night before. The other man, who was introduced as Police Chief Nostogen, nodded and puffed on a stubby pipe as he listened. While the boys got to the part about the man named Sam, Mr. Crenshaw turned to the police chief. "This fellow Sam," he asked, "can you place him?" "Sounds like Sam Robinson to me," the chief said, a trifle grimly. "Know him well. Been in jail a few times. Do anything for money and likes to play practical jokes. Wonder if he could have been trying some crazy joke last night. Expect I'll have to ask him a few questions." "That was no practical joke," Mr. Crenshaw exploded. "I want to ask that fellow some questions myself. 1, how he knew the boys were coming. 2, how he knew they were amateur investigators. And 3, why he marooned them on that island. Why, we might not have found them until today or tomorrow if that boy Chris hadn't rescued them." "That's a fact," the chief agreed. "When we learned you lads had got off the plane and then vanished into thin air, we were looking on lane for you, stopped cars for miles around to ask questions." "What I want to know," said Mr. Crenshaw, "is how this kid Chris was able to find you so easily. What's his story?" The 3 boys were forced to confess they had forgotten to ask him. They had meant to, then they had seen the merry-go-round and the ghostly figure of a woman on it, and in the excitement, the question had slipped their minds. "You saw the ghost?" Mr. Crenshaw exclaimed. "But that's impossible. The phantom of the merry-go-round is just a local superstition." "Now, hold on a minute," Chief Nostogen said. "Folks around here believe in that phantom pretty strongly. The last few years, more than one fisherman has seen it on a stormy night out on Skeleton Island. Hardly a soul will go near that island now. What's more, the whole town is buzzing about the phantom riding the merry-go-round last night. Lots of folks heard the music, and a few got out spyglasses and could see a white figure, just like these boys describe it. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, but you can't get a soul in these parts to believe poor Miss Sally Farrington's spirit wasn't trying to ride that merry-go-round last night." Pete's father shook his head. "This whole part of the picture is jinxed. I'll bet not a single workman shows up today." "And maybe not tomorrow either," agreed Chief Nostogen. "Well, Mr. Crenshaw, I'll pick up Sam Robinson and ask him some questions. But we still don't know just how the boy Chris found these lads last night. It's darn suspicious if you ask me," Mr. Crenshaw said. "That kid has been pestering me for a job, but he's got a bad reputation locally. Plenty of people say he's a clever little thief. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a hand in all the trouble we've been having." "Chris didn't seem like a thief to us, Dad," Pete put in. "He seemed like an all-right kid. He has a sick father to help, and he sails round looking for washed-up treasure, but that's nothing against him." "The boy's right," Chief Nostigen agreed. "I know Chris has a bad reputation, but he's a foreigner, and most folks in this town are pretty clannish. They're ready to believe anything bad of a foreigner." "Just the same, I have my suspicions of him," Mr. Crenshaw declared. "Now that I think of it, it could easily be a boy stealing our equipment. Maybe he's hoping to sell it to help his father." He stood up. "All right, boys, let's get going. Mr. Denton himself is waiting out on the island for us. Chief, I'll be seeing you later. Meanwhile, I hope you can find this Sam Robinson and clap him in jail." A few minutes later, Jupiter, Pete and Bob were in a fast motorboat speeding to Skeleton Island. They would have liked to look around Fishing Port more, but they didn't have time. They saw many docks and piers, but few boats. They understood that most fishermen had gone to the south end of Atlantic Bay, where oystering was still safe and legal. All in all, Fishing Port looked like a small and very poor fishing village. Now, as the speedboat raced through the water, they eyed the island ahead with interest. It was a mile long, well wooded, and had a small hill towards the north end. They could barely see the remains of the pleasure park through the trees. Across this mile of water, boats had once ferried gay crowds of merrymakers, but that day was far in the past. They coasted into an old pier at the south end of Skeleton Island, and Pete made a line fast. Another motorboat was tied up there, a wide craft with special steps over the side, the kind of boat often used for scuba diving. Mr. Crenshaw led the boys up a well-marked trail. They soon reached a clearing where 2 trailers and several large army-style tents had been set up. "There's Mr. Denton," Pete's father said. "He drove down from Philadelphia yesterday for a conference and is going right back." A young man wearing horn-rimmed glasses came towards them. Behind him, 3 other men waited, one with greying hair who the boys soon learned was Harry Norris, the assistant director, a blond young man with a crew cut who was Jeff Morton, and a big barrel-chested man with a stiff left arm and a gun strapped to his waist who was Tom Faraday, the guard. "This is our camp for now," Mr. Crenshaw went on. "We ferried the trailers and equipment over on a barge. The tents are all right until the main company gets here, then we'll need more trailers." He pointed out and identified the other men, then spoke to Roger Denton, the director. "Sorry to be a little late, Mr. Denton," he said. "I stopped to get the boys." "Good," Roger Denton said. He looked rather upset. "Harry Norris has just been telling me all about the delays, and I'm not happy about them. If you find you can't get the roller coaster working in a week, we'll forget Skeleton Island altogether. It's a great place for the scenery we want, but we may be able to save money by renting a roller coaster back in California and artificially aging it. We can take back ground shots here that will give us the wonderful old dilapidated effect." "I'm positive we can get the roller coaster fixed," Mr. Crenshaw said. "I've got a call out for carpenters now." "I doubt if you'll get them," Roger Denton said grimly. "Not since the whole town knows the ghost was seen riding the merry-go-round last night." "That ghost!" Pete's father exclaimed. "I wish I could figure that out." Tom Faraday, standing a few feet away, coughed apologetically. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Crenshaw," he said. "I guess, well, I'm afraid I was the ghost folks saw last night."